They said I would never be worthy of wearing a wedding dress. That being a single mother was a life sentence. And maybe you've heard something similar. Your past ruined your future. But what if I told you that's a lie? That God uses exactly what the world rejects to write stories of honor. I know what it feels like to carry the weight of judgment. At 19, pregnant and alone, I was rejected by the church where I grew up. What once was a place of refuge turned into a place of shame. The wound was so deep that for a long time I believed I would never be loved again. But it was in that same valley that I discovered faithfulness to God doesn't depend on people's approval. I'm here to tell you something you might find hard to believe. No matter how many people said you don't deserve it, God can raise someone who will look at you and see the exact opposite. That's what happened to me when a man of God came into my life and said, "You are everything I prayed for." What once seemed impossible became real, and I want to show you how persevering faith can turn any sentence of defeat into a story of victory. When I introduce myself, I usually say I'm living proof that faith can transform even the most torn pages of a story. My name is Jocelyn. I'm 33 years old. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm married to a man of God who changed my life. If you had met me a few years ago, you might have said it would be impossible for me to be where I am now. But I've learned that when God decides how the story ends, no one can erase it. Today, I live a reality that once felt far out of reach. Life led me through hard roads, the kind you think you'll never survive. I felt the weight of judgment, the pain of loneliness, and I've cried through nights believing my prayers never made it past the ceiling. But here I am, looking back and realizing that every tear was a brick God used to build a new version of my life. I've always liked to think of life as a book. Every chapter can hold a surprise, even when we start to believe the story has no way forward. And I'll admit, for a long time, I thought my testimony would be marked only by mistakes and regrets. But God showed me that He has the final word. And it's no exaggeration to say He rewrote my future when everything seemed lost. I've heard people tell me, "Jocelyn, you're lucky." But I don't call it luck. I call it grace. Luck is random, but grace is God's hand bringing order out of chaos. And that's exactly what happened to me. It was grace that lifted me up, that gave color to the gray pages of my story, and that taught me even deserts can hide flowers that bloom when you least expect it. I still remember the times I thought my life would never be restored, that no one would ever see me beyond the mistakes of my past. The feeling of being invisible to others, and even to myself, was real. But you know what's most beautiful? Discovering that even when the world turns its back, God keeps watching, caring, and preparing something far greater than we could ever imagine. And that's why I'm here, sharing not just words, but a real testimony from someone who has felt what it's like to hit rock bottom. I know you may be going through something similar, thinking your life can't be restored. But I want to open my heart and tell you, there is a way. And I'll share with you how it began for me. When I think about my teenage years, I remember the sparkle in my eyes whenever I imagined the future. I dreamed of studying, building a career, meeting someone who loved God as much as I did, and together building a strong family. In my mind, it all seemed so certain. I grew up believing that if I stayed faithful, blessings would naturally come. It felt like my life was already a finished puzzle, ready to be lived. Back then, I spent hours at youth services, sang in choirs, helped with church events, and always said I wanted to be used by God. My heart burned with passion for the Lord, and I truly believed nothing could pull me away from that path. Maybe you've experienced that phase too, when everything feels simple, as if faith alone could keep you from stumbling. I thought that way too. I remember writing in journals about the plans I had for my life. I would jot down the names of colleges, ideas for mission projects, and even lists of qualities I hoped to find in the man who would one day be my husband. Looking back now, I can see how full of expectations I was. And in a way, that gave me confidence to walk with my head held high, believing life was waiting for me with a smile. But teenage years also carry silent dangers. It's that stage when we think we know everything, but in reality, we know very little. I believed I had control over my story, but I couldn't see the traps around me. And when you don't notice them, that's exactly when life can turn upside down. It was as if I was building a castle of dreams on sand, convinced it could withstand any wave. I never imagined that soon the tide would rise and sweep away not only my plans, but also the confidence I had in my future. Up until then, I only knew faith in theory, but I was about to learn, in the hardest way, what it really means to depend completely on God. And it was in that world of colorful dreams and youthful confidence that the news came. News that completely changed the course of my life. News that not only shattered my expectations, but also deeply tested my faith and my relationship with God. I will never forget the day I found out I was pregnant. It felt like the ground had opened beneath my feet. I, who had so many dreams neatly planned out, suddenly found myself lost in a whirlwind of emotions. That positive test wasn't just 2 red lines. It felt like a weight crashing down on me, crushing every expectation I had for the future. My heart raced, and while fear was swallowing me up, there was also this strange mix of love rising inside me. I didn't yet know what it meant to be a mother, but deep down, I already sensed that a life depended on me. Along with that realization came the questions no one ever prepares you to answer. Now what? What am I gonna do? How do I tell my family? The first person to notice my anguish was my mom, Donna. She had always been observant. And in that moment, even without me saying a word, she already knew something was wrong. When I finally gathered the courage to tell her, I saw the disappointment written all over her face. It was as if I had broken not only my own dreams, but hers as well. That look stayed etched in my memory, a mirror of my own shame. In that moment, the weight I carried wasn't just the pregnancy itself, but the judgment I knew was coming. My mother's eyes reminded me that I was no longer the perfect daughter everyone thought I was. And the hardest part was that I didn't even know if I had the strength to bear it. The faith that once seemed so strong now trembled like a flame about to go out. I remember crying myself to sleep that night. I held my pillow as if it were the only place where I could fall apart. I whispered a short prayer, barely audible, saying only, "God, please don't leave me now." It was a timid prayer, but it was real, and somehow it kept me going. I didn't know how, but I could feel He was still there, even in the middle of the storm. And that's how a new chapter of my story began. A season marked not only by the pain of discovery, but also by the weight of the judgment I was about to face from the very community I had always loved. If there was ever a moment when I truly felt the weight of judgment, it was when I went back to church after finding out I was pregnant. I expected to be welcomed with open arms. After all, wasn't that the place where I had always been taught about grace and forgiveness? But what I found were sideways glances, whispers in the hallways, and a heavy silence that hurt more than words ever could. The place that once was my refuge suddenly felt like a field of stones. Pastor Harold, the youth leader, called me out in such a cold way that it made me shrink inside. He didn't raise his voice, but his words carried more weight than any shout. "You need to think about the consequences of your actions," he said, in a tone that sounded less like guidance and more like a sentence. In that moment, I felt I was no longer a daughter, but a defendant standing before an invisible court.
The rejection wasn't just institutional, it was relational. Young people who once sat beside me started to move away as if I carried some visible mark that could contaminate them. What hurt the most wasn't what was said, but what wasn't. No one asked how I was doing. No one offered to pray with me. No one reached out a hand. The silence became a wall, and I was left on the outside. It's interesting how we discover who truly understands the heart of the gospel in moments of weakness. Because talking about loving your neighbor in a packed service is easy, practicing that love when someone falls is much harder. And in that season, I had fallen, desperately needing support. But instead of a hug, I got distance. Instead of restoration, I got judgment. That distance from the church left me confused about my faith. I asked myself, did God reject me too? It was hard to separate people's voices from God's voice. But deep down, something in me kept saying that he hadn't turned his back. Maybe you felt that too. The difference between the harshness of people and the quiet tenderness of God. And it was in that void of acceptance, in that emptiness of human support, that a new pain began to rise. The pain of losing not only the trust of the church, but also the friendships of those who had walked with me since childhood.
I know that facing judgment from the church was already painful, but losing true friendships felt like having my heart torn to pieces. Melissa Brooks had been my friend since childhood. She knew my silliest laughs and my deepest secrets. We grew up together, sharing dreams, and I was certain our friendship could survive any storm. But when the pregnancy came, so did her distance. At first, I tried to believe it was just lack of time, that she was busy with her commitments. I sent messages, I called, but her answers grew shorter and colder. Until one day, I realized Melissa no longer wanted to be associated with me. It was as if my situation had become a label too heavy for her to carry. That rejection hurt more than any harsh word ever could. Friends are like siblings we choose, and losing one feels like losing a part of yourself. I found myself alone in the moments when I most needed support. As my belly began to show, the silence of Melissa's absence was louder than the whispers in the church. And it's striking how, in times like these, we learn that not everyone who starts the journey with us has the courage to walk it through to the end. I remember one time passing her on the street and feeling the quick, evasive glance she gave me. There was no smile, no hug, just a rush to walk away. It felt like a knife to my chest. I kept asking myself, how can someone who knew me so well now not even look me in the eyes? That's when I realized some people only stay by our side as long as our stories fit within their standards. It's in moments like these that we discovered the true value of prayer. Many times, all I could do was cry before God and say, Lord, I don't understand. I had no answers, but I found comfort in remembering that He would never leave me. Even without friends, even without support, there was still a God willing to listen to my broken heart. And it was in those days of tears and lonely prayers that the hardest nights came. Long nights when silence swallowed me and I questioned whether I was still worthy of being loved by God. The nights were the hardest. When everyone else was asleep and silence filled the house, my mind wouldn't stop. I remembered every harsh word I had heard, every friendship I had lost, every look of judgment. And there, alone in my room, it all seemed to come back like an echo, crushing me all over again. Regret followed me like a shadow that refused to leave my side. There were nights when I cried until I had no strength left. I kept asking myself if I was still worthy of God's love. Did He see me the same way people did? Did I still have the right to a future? Those questions consumed me, and no matter how hard I tried to quiet the pain, it always returned stronger the moment I closed my eyes. It was during that time that I learned prayer doesn't need to be beautiful to be heard. Many times, my words were nothing but sobs. All I could say was, "Lord, forgive me. Don't leave me alone." And even without an immediate answer, I felt something different. It was as if a gentle peace slowly entered the room, reminding me that God wasn't far away, even when everything around me screamed otherwise. I can say it was in that dark valley that I truly understood what faith is, because faith isn't about feeling like everything is in order. Faith is choosing to keep believing even when you see no way out. For me, believing in that season meant lifting my head each day and deciding my story would not end there. I didn't know how, but I trusted that God still had a plan. I also began to understand the power of confession. Instead of running from God's presence, I ran to Him with my broken heart. I told Him about every mistake, every fear, every regret. And little by little, I realized I wasn't rejected by Him. I was cared for, shaped, and taught. That's the lesson I carry with me to this day. When everyone else saw me as a mistake, God still saw me as purpose. And it was that certainty, built in nights of tears, that began to give me strength to move forward. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose how to live the present. And it was right then that I decided to rise up, raise my daughter with dignity, and remain faithful to God, even without human support. There came a moment when I realized that crying every night wouldn't change my reality. I could drown in guilt, or I could choose to fight. That's when prayer stopped being just a way to let my feelings out and became my daily weapon. Every morning, before even getting out of bed, I would say, "God, give me strength for today." I no longer asked for a perfect future, only for the courage to take the next step. I learned to hold on to small victories. Being able to get up, take care of the house, and prepare a meal was already progress. Whenever I felt drained, I reminded myself that there was a life inside me depending on my faith. And when you realize someone needs you, love becomes fuel. Abby hadn't even been born yet, but she was already the reason I stayed standing. There were days I forced myself to open the Bible even when I didn't feel like it. And it was amazing to see how the Word came alive right in the middle of my wounds. Verses that once felt distant now burned inside me like personal promises. I would underline them, write dates next to them, and they became a memorial that God was with me. If you're going through struggles, I encourage you to do the same. Write, mark, and keep the Word as a live-in reminder. I also began to understand that faith shows itself in practical actions. I couldn't just pray and wait for everything to fall from heaven. I had to act, look for work, organize my days, and learn to be resilient. It was during that time I discovered that faith isn't passive, it's movement. It's taking steps even when your feet are trembling. Every simple decision, like choosing to smile even without feeling like it, was an act of resistance against despair. One of the greatest lessons I learned was that faithfulness doesn't depend on human recognition. Many times, no one applauded my choices, no one noticed my efforts, but I knew God saw every detail, and that thought sustained me. I would tell myself, if the Lord sees it, that's enough. That certainty gave me courage to keep going, even without anyone's approval. That's how, step by step, I started to lift my head again. It wasn't my own strength, but a strength that came from faith, from prayer, and from the conviction that God was still writing my story. And that decision prepared me for the most challenging phase, raising my daughter on my own, balancing work, motherhood, and trust in God.
When Abigail was born, my life changed forever. Looking at that tiny face made me understand once and for all what unconditional love really is. I could no longer live just for myself. Now I had a mission. And even though fear still pressed heavily on my chest, something inside me said, "You can do this because God is with you." It was as if every smile of hers confirmed that my story was far from over. Raising Abby on my own wasn't easy. I had to work hard, often in jobs that weren't what I dreamed of, but that put food on the table. Between shifts, I rushed to care for her, prepare her bottle, and put her to sleep. The exhaustion was immense, but there was a quiet joy in knowing that despite all the difficulties, I was fulfilling my role as a mother. There were days when money barely covered the basics. I found myself counting coins to buy milk or diapers. In those moments, I would kneel and pray, "Lord, please don't let us lack." And somehow, we never did. Sometimes a neighbor would show up with a bag of groceries, other times an unexpected discount at the store. Those little details taught me that God cares even for the smallest acts of love. But harder than material provision was the emotional weight. I had to be strong for both myself and Abby, even when I felt fragile. There were days when she looked at me with those curious eyes, and I thought, I can't give up because she needs me whole. And that's when faith lifted me again. I wasn't perfect, but I could be present, and that was already so much. To help Abby grow up in a faith-filled environment, I created simple habits at home. I read Bible stories before bed, taught her small prayers, and even played worship songs while we tidied the house together. These moments, though small, planted seeds that blossomed in her heart. And if you're a parent, you can start the same way. A short prayer, a word of hope, a song of praise at the end of the day. And so we went on, side by side, learning together to walk by faith. I didn't know what the future held, but I was certain that God was shaping us for something greater. Years passed, and the wait for a fresh start in my love life seemed endless.
The years went by, and with them came the feeling that maybe I would end up alone. I watched my friends get married, build families, and post happy photos, while I returned home with only Abigail and the silence of the night. It wasn't envy, it was that tightness in my chest, asking, "And me, Lord? Do you have someone prepared for me too?" I confess there were moments when I almost lost hope. I prayed for a companion, but it seemed like God wasn't listening. It felt as if the heavens were closed on the subject. I even tried to convince myself that maybe my destiny was to live only as a mother, and that I should accept that. But deep down, there was still a desire to be loved and to share life with someone. With each birthday, the feeling grew stronger. When I turned 30, I remember crying alone, thinking my time had passed. I said, "Lord, I'm not so young anymore. Who would want someone with a child?" Those words echoed in my mind, and the rejection from my past still weighed on me like an open wound. It seemed impossible to believe that anyone could see me beyond my story. But even in the midst of that pain, something inside pushed me to remain faithful. I kept serving God even without answers. I continued taking Abby to church even when I felt out of place. I kept praying even when it felt like I was talking to myself. It was as if my faith was being tested in the fire, and every waiting period was an invitation to trust God a little more. The most surprising thing was that while I waited, God was working in other areas of my life. I matured, learned to be resilient, and discovered that my value wasn't in being chosen by a man, but in being loved by God. That was the lesson that kept me steady. Before giving me someone, the Lord wanted me to understand who I was in Him. And it was precisely when I had almost given up, when hope seemed to have faded, that the unexpected happened. At 33, on an ordinary day, God crossed my path with someone who would change my entire story. I never imagined that at 33, something could happen so unexpectedly. I was on a casual, simple outing with no expectations, just living my day. But God, as He always does, had bigger plans. It was there, in that seemingly ordinary moment, that I met Christopher Carter, someone who was about to change my life forever. There was something in his eyes that made me feel welcomed immediately. It wasn't just kindness, it was something deeper, like he could see beyond my wounds and the past I carried. That feeling of being understood and valued, even without words, brought me a peace I hadn't felt in years. It was as if God had placed a piece of heaven in front of me in the form of a person. Talking to Chris felt so natural, it was like we had known each other for a long time. He spoke about God with love and conviction, and every word that came from him strengthened my own faith. I felt safe, like my pain and scars wouldn't be judged, but embraced. It was in that moment that I realized God still had something great in store for me. And little by little, I understood that this meeting wasn't a coincidence. Every detail, from his smile to the way we connected, seemed carefully orchestrated by the Lord. Life had shown me many closed doors before, but this one was open, shining, as if saying, "Now is the right time, Jocelyn." Abby, my daughter, seemed to notice the difference too. When I talked about Chris at home, she smiled in a way that filled my heart with hope. I wanted to believe it was possible to find someone who not only loved me, but accepted my story, my daughter, and became an extension of God's care in our lives. And it was in that simple, yet deeply meaningful encounter that everything began to fall into place. Little did I know, the next step would bring words that would mark my soul forever and change the way I saw myself. I will never forget the day Chris looked into my eyes and said something that changed everything. He said, "You are everything I asked the Lord for." In that moment, I felt as if God was speaking directly to me. Those words carried recognition, value, and love, something I had never experienced so purely. It was as if every rejection, every judgment, and every tear suddenly made sense. Hearing those words made me realize that God always had plans for me, even when I thought everything was lost. He had prepared a God-fearing man who could see beyond my past and see my heart. It was as if the Lord was saying, "I haven't forgotten you, Jocelyn. Look who I brought to honor you." I felt my heart open in a way it hadn't in a long time. The pain of the past didn't vanish instantly, but those words began to heal old wounds. For the first time, I understood that being a single mother, facing rejection, and enduring judgment wasn't an obstacle. It was part of the story God would use to show His faithfulness. Abby also became part of that moment of grace. When Chris began interacting with her, I realized that he didn't see my daughter as a burden or complication, but as someone worthy of love and care. It was impossible not to thank God, because this man was bringing a love that reflected His heart. And in that moment, I understood something profound about faith and patience. God honors those who remain faithful, even when everything seems impossible. Chris's words weren't just his own. They were the echo of God's promise in my life, a confirmation that every tear shed, every silent prayer had been heard. And so, with these words marking my soul, I realized that we were only beginning to walk a path of love, acceptance, and restoration, preparing the ground for something even deeper, Abigail's acceptance and the building of a true family. One of the most surprising things was seeing Chris accept Abigail as his own daughter, without hesitation. He didn't just love me, he embraced my story, my daughter, and everything I had been through. It was as if God had placed in front of me a man who understood that true love goes beyond the past, beyond human mistakes, and is revealed through commitment and care. Abby quickly grew attached to him. Watching the two of them together, I felt a mix of relief and gratitude. Every laugh, every trusting glance showed me that we had found more than a partner. We had found an extension of God's grace in our lives. His presence transformed our home, bringing a sense of safety and joy I didn't know still existed. It was in that moment that I truly understood what faith and perseverance mean in practice. I could have given up, but I stayed faithful to God and to my story. And He, in His perfect timing, brought someone who honored my life and showed me that real love doesn't reject, doesn't judge, doesn't abandon. It simply embraces. Living daily with Chris also taught me a lot about patience and forgiveness. Building a new family isn't just about receiving love. It's about learning to give, to listen, to understand, and to respect each person's pace. He never tried to erase my past. On the contrary, he always reminded me that my story had value, and together we could write the next chapters with faith and hope. I never imagined I would feel such peace seeing my daughter cared for by someone who wasn't her biological father, but loved her as if he were. Every gesture, every word, every act of care strengthened my belief that God honors those who remain faithful, even in the darkest moments. And that's how, little by little, our family became to grow stronger. Abby, Chris, and I were more than just people living together. We were a living testament that God's faithfulness transforms hearts and restores lives, preparing the way for what was to come, a new beginning full of joy and hope.
The day of our wedding felt like watching an old dream come to life. It wasn't just a ceremony, it was a celebration of God's faithfulness in my story. Every detail seemed to say, "Jocelyn, I have honored you." I felt recognized, loved, and finally whole. It was a new chapter, written with faith and gratitude. Seeing Chris take on the commitment to care for Abigail as if she were his own daughter brought a joy words can't describe. That act showed me that true love doesn't measure the past, it builds the future. And on that day, I could see concrete proof that God honors those who remain faithful, even when everything seems lost. My mother, Donna, stood by my side, emotional. After so many years of disappointment, she could witness the restoration God had worked. Seeing the pride and recognition on her face was another confirmation that perseverance and faith transforms hearts and reconciles relationships. Prayer and patience had finally borne visible fruit. The friends who stayed, the community that returned to support us, and even small reconciliations with those who had distanced themselves made the moment even more special. It was as if all the tears shed over the years had turned into joy, and every hardship had been used by God to prepare us for something greater. And in this new beginning, I understood the true depth of God's promise. Even when we are rejected, doubted, or despised, God still writes happy endings. A new chapter, a new family, a new story of love and faith was just beginning, and I could hardly wait to share the next step with everyone who had witnessed my journey.
Today, looking at my life, I can clearly see God's faithfulness. Every tear, every night of prayer, every challenge faced alone was part of a greater plan. My story isn't just mine. It's a testimony that God honors those who remain faithful, even when everything seems impossible. And I want other women to understand this deeply. If you are going through rejection, pain, or judgment, know that you are not alone. I've been there, feeling the weight of abandonment and disappointment. But constant prayer, persevering faith, and trust in the Lord can completely change the course of your story. God doesn't forget those who stay firm, even when no one else believes. Raising Abigail on my own was one of the greatest challenges of my life, but it also taught me about courage, love, and faith. I learned that our story of pain can become a story of victory when we allow God to guide our steps. Every obstacle we face becomes a stepping stone, leading us to the place He has prepared. And when I met Chris, I realized that God always reserves the best for those who don't give in to bitterness or despair. He showed me that it's possible to live a true love that embraces not only the past, but also the wounds, and transforms your entire life. This is the kind of love only God can prepare. I want to invite you, who are watching, to reflect. What step of faith have you not yet taken? Which dreams have you stopped believing in because of fear of judgment? Today, my invitation is for you to stand up, pray, trust, and allow God to write a surprising ending to your story, just as He did for me. And if my story has touched your heart, know that here on the Faith Story channel, there is space for you to share your own journey. Share your testimony in the comments, inspire other women, and together we can show that faith transforms lives. Your story could be the next living proof of God's love and faithfulness.